The first time Nolan Quarry left firewood on her doorstep, Rhea Pallor thought someone had made a mistake. She woke to frost thick enough to crack branches and found the stack leaning against her door frame. Each log split clean and stacked with the care of someone who knew what a killing cold could do. The wood was seasoned oak, the kind that burned slow and hot, the kind she could not afford after paying what her brother had left behind. She stood in the doorway with her breath misting white and looked at the pile like it might bite her. Charity always had teeth, in her experience. People did not give things away without expecting something back, something that would cost more than the original gift ever could have been worth. She brought the wood inside because freezing to prove a point seemed stupid even by her standards, but she did not burn it right away. Instead, she let it sit by her hearth while she tried to figure out who had left it and what they would want when they came to collect. The frost held for 3 days, the kind of cold that made the ground ring like iron when you walked on it. And on the second night, she finally fed the oak into her fire because her hands had gone numb enough that she could not hold her carving knife steady. The warmth that filled her small cabin felt like an accusation. On the 4th morning, the frost broke, and she went looking. Her cabin sat on the edge of a stretch of cleared land that had once been her brother's dream and was now just hers. A few acres carved out of the forest with a vegetable patch and a chicken coop, and not much else. The nearest neighbor was a 1/4 mile through the trees, a man who had moved in sometime last spring and kept to himself. She had seen him twice in passing, once at the village market and once on the road, and both times he had nodded to her and kept walking. He was human, which meant he probably thought she was a monster, and she was orc, which meant she knew better than to expect anything different. She found his place just after dawn, a small farmstead with a barn and a house that looked like it had been built by someone who knew what he was doing. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray line. She did not bother with the door, just walked around back to where she could hear the sound of an axe splitting wood. He was there in his yard, with his shirt sleeves rolled up despite the cold, working through a pile of logs with the steady rhythm of someone who had been at it for a while. When he saw her, he stopped mid-swing and set the axe down, and she noticed that he did not reach for it again or look at her like she might be dangerous. He just waited. Rhea crossed the yard and stopped a few paces away, close enough to be heard without shouting but far enough that it would not feel like a threat. She was tall for an orc woman, just shy of 5.5 feet, with the kind of build that came from years of splitting her own wood and hauling her own water. Her skin was the green of summer leaves, and her tusks were small enough that they did not interfere with her speech, just pressed against her lower lip when her mouth was closed. She wore her black hair tied back and her work clothes patched at the knees, and she did not care what he thought of any of it. "You left wood on my doorstep," she said. He nodded. He was maybe 30, with brown hair that needed cutting and the kind of face that did not give much away. Tall, broad in the shoulders, with hands that showed calluses in all the same places hers did. "I did. What do you want in return?" The question came out harder than she meant it to, but she did not take it back. She had learned a long time ago that it was better to know the price up front than to find out later when you could not afford to pay. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, though she could not have said what. Then he said, "Company at dinner, if ever." She stared at him. "That is it. That is it. You do not want anything else?" No, Rhea did not believe him. Nobody gave away good firewood during a frost for nothing more than the possibility of a dinner guest. There had to be more to it, some angle she was not seeing yet, and she did not plan to stick around long enough to find out what it was. She turned and walked back through the trees without another word, and if he called after her, she did not hear it. That should have been the end of it, but it was not. 2 weeks later, she found another stack of wood on her doorstep, and this time there was no frost to justify it. She burned through it over the course of the month because wasting good fuel seemed wrong even if accepting it felt worse. And when it was gone, she told herself she would refuse the next delivery if there was one. But there was, and she did not. The wood kept coming, a stack every few weeks, always when she was out or asleep, always left without a word. She never saw him do it. She never asked him to stop. Winter deepened, and the snow came, thick and heavy, and Rhea spent her days carving small figures from scrap wood to sell at the village market. Her brother had left her the cabin and the land, and a debt she had not known about until after he was buried. Money owed to a man named Fergus Thorne who lived in the village and made his living buying up debts and collecting on them with interest. Thorne had come to her door a week after the funeral and told her what was owed, and the number had been high enough that she knew she would be paying it off for years. He came by once a month to collect what she could scrape together, and every time he looked at her like he was calculating how much more he could squeeze out before she broke. She did not break, but it was close some days. The wood helped. She did not have to spend what little she earned on fuel, which meant she could put more toward the debt, and she hated that it helped because it meant she owed someone something and she did not know how to pay it back. Company at dinner, he had said, as if that was all he wanted. As if she could believe that. She saw Nolan Quarry a few more times over the winter, always in passing. Once at the market where he was buying salt and flour. Once on the road where he was hauling a cartload of something covered in canvas. Once outside the blacksmith shop where he was picking up a repaired harness. He nodded to her each time, the same as before, and did not try to speak to her or ask her anything. She did not know what to make of him. Most humans either ignored her completely or watched her like they expected her to do something violent, but he did neither. He just acknowledged her and moved on, and it was somehow worse than either of the alternatives because it felt deliberate. Spring came, and the snow melted and Rhea planted her garden. The same vegetables she grew every year because they were what she knew how to keep alive. Potatoes and carrots and onions, beans and squash and a few herbs. She worked the soil until her back ached and her hands blistered, and when she was done, she looked at the neat rows and felt the same grim satisfaction she always did. This was hers. She had built it, she maintained it, and no one could take it from her as long as she kept working, but the debt was still there, and Thorne was still coming to collect. She was in the garden pulling weeds when he arrived in late spring, riding a horse that was too fine for a man in his line of work, and dressed in clothes that were meant to make him look respectable. He dismounted and walked to the edge of her garden and stood there watching her like he had all the time in the world. "Rhea Pallor," he said, and his voice was the kind of smooth that made her skin crawl. "I trust you have this month's payment ready." She did, barely. She stood and wiped her hands on her trousers and went inside to get the coins, and when she came back out, he counted them slowly, making a show of it. He always did. "You are falling behind," he said when he was done. "The interest is adding up faster than you can pay it down. At this rate, you will be in debt to me for the rest of your life. I am paying what I can. Perhaps you should be paying more." She did not answer that because there was nothing to say. She was already giving him everything she could spare. If she gave him more, she would not be able to eat, and she suspected that was exactly what he wanted. People who were starving made poor decisions, and poor decisions were profitable for men like Thorne. He pocketed the coins and gave her a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I will see you next month, Miss Pallor. Do try to have the full amount ready. It would be unfortunate if I had to start considering alternative forms of payment. He left before she could tell him what she thought of his alternatives, and she stood in her garden with her hands clenched into fists and tried not to think about what would happen if she could not keep up with the payments. Thorne had a reputation. People who could not pay him back lost their land, their homes, their livelihoods. She had heard stories of families turned out with nothing, of debts passed down through generations, of people who had signed away their freedom just to clear what they owed. She would not let that happen to her. She could not, but she did not know how to stop it either. The wood kept coming. Rhea stopped trying to figure out why. She burned it and told herself it did not matter, that as long as she did not agree to his dinner invitation, she did not owe him anything, but the logic felt thin even to her. Every stack of firewood was another weight on the scale, another thing she could not repay, and the not knowing what he would eventually ask for was worse than if he had just demanded something outright. At least then, she would know what she was dealing with. Summer came, and with it the heat, and she did not need the firewood anymore, but it still appeared, stacked neatly by her door like always. She thought about confronting him again, about demanding he stop, but she did not. Instead, she stacked the wood in her shed and tried not to think about it, and when she saw him in the village, she looked the other way. He did not seem bothered by her avoidance. He just kept to his routine, working his land and minding his business, and if he noticed that she refused to acknowledge him, he gave no sign of it. It should have made things easier, but it did not. It just made her feel worse. She was at the market in midsummer when she overheard two women talking about him. They were standing by a stall selling eggs and butter, and they did not notice her nearby because people rarely did. Orcs were good at being invisible when they wanted to be, at blending into the background until humans forgot they were there. "He is a strange one," the first woman said. She was older, with gray in her hair and the kind of voice that carried. "Keeps to himself, does not talk much. I heard he was a soldier before he came here." "A soldier," the second woman said. She sounded younger, more curious. "What kind of soldier?" "The kind that does not talk about it. My husband says he saw scars on his arms once, the sort you get from fighting, not farming. But he has been nothing but polite since he moved in, so I suppose it does not matter what he was before." "You think he is looking for a wife?" "He is not bad looking," the first woman laughed. "If he is going about it the wrong way. He barely speaks to anyone. Though I did see him at the Pallor girl's place once, back in the spring. Maybe he has an eye for her." "The orc girl, surely not." "Why not? She is young and healthy and she owns her land. That is more than most can say. She is an orc. So, he does not strike me as the type to care about that sort of thing." Rhea left before she could hear any more. Her face felt hot and her hands were shaking, and she did not know if it was anger or embarrassment or something else entirely. She did not want to be the subject of village gossip, did not want people speculating about her and Nolan Quarry like there was something between them when there was not. He had left her firewood. That was all. It did not mean anything. But the idea stuck with her anyway, burrowing into her thoughts like a splinter she could not dig out. An eye for her. As if someone like him would look at someone like her and see anything worth wanting, as if she would want him to. She tried to put it out of her mind, but it was hard when the wood kept coming, and Thorne kept taking her money, and the debt kept growing no matter how much she paid. By late summer, she was desperate enough to take on extra work, hiring herself out to a farmer on the other side of the village to help with the harvest. The work was brutal, long days in the fields under the sun, but it paid better than her carvings, and she needed every coin she could get. She came home each night too tired to think, and that was a blessing in its own way. The wood was still there in the morning. She was walking back from the fields one evening in early autumn when she saw Nolan on the road ahead of her. He was heading in the same direction, carrying a sack of something over one shoulder, and for a moment she considered turning around and taking the long way home just to avoid him. But that felt cowardly, and she had never been a coward, so she kept walking. He heard her footsteps and glanced back, and when he saw her, he slowed his pace until she caught up. They walked in silence for a while, the only sound their boots on the dirt road and the evening birds in the trees. It should have been awkward, but it was not. It was just quiet. Finally he said, "You have been working the Granger farm." It was not a question. She nodded anyway. The harvest, hard work, it pays. He did not ask why she needed the money, which she appreciated. Instead he said, "You look tired." "I am fine." "I did not say you were not." They walked a bit farther and then he said, "The offer still stands if you ever want to take it." She knew what he meant without him having to explain. Company at dinner if ever. She stopped walking and turned to look at him, and he stopped too, waiting. In the fading light his face was all shadows and angles, and she could not read his expression. "Why?" she asked, and hated herself for asking because it made her sound like she cared. "Why do you keep leaving the wood? Why do you want me to have dinner with you? What is this about?" He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "Because you should not have to be alone all the time." It was the last thing she had expected him to say, and it hit her harder than any demand for payment could have. She did not know what to say to that, did not know how to respond to something that sounded almost like kindness without a hook in it, so she did not say anything at all. She just turned and kept walking, and after a moment she heard him do the same. But the question stayed with her, and so did his answer. Autumn deepened, and the leaves turned and the air grew cold again, and Rhea kept working and carving and paying Thorn what she could. The debt was not shrinking. If anything, it was growing, the interest eating up more of each payment until she was barely making a dent in the principal. She did the math one night and realized that at the rate she was going, she would be paying Thorn for the rest of her life, and still not clear what her brother had owed. The knowledge sat in her chest like a stone. She was in her workshop the day Thorn came with the bailiff. It was late autumn, cold enough that she had a fire going in the small stove that kept the shed warm. She was finishing a carving of a deer, something she thought might sell well at the winter market, when she heard the horses outside. She set down her knife and went to the door, and her stomach dropped when she saw who it was. Thorn was there on his fine horse, and next to him was a man she recognized as the bailiff from the village, the one who enforced debts and evictions when things got bad enough. They dismounted, and Thorn walked toward her with that same smile he always wore, the one that made her want to hit him. "Miss Pallor," he said, "I am afraid we have a problem. I paid you last month. You did, but not enough. The debt is now 4 months past due in full, and I have been more than patient. The bailiff is here to witness the seizure of property to cover what is owed." The words took a moment to register, and when they did she felt like the ground had dropped out from under her. "You cannot do that." "I can, and I am. The law allows it. You signed the agreement when you took on your brother's debt." "I did not take it on. I inherited it." "The distinction does not matter. The debt is yours and you have failed to pay it. Now step aside so we can inventory what you have." She did not step aside. She stood in the doorway of her workshop with her hands clenched and her heart pounding, and for a wild moment she thought about fighting them. But the bailiff had a sword on his hip, and Thorn had the law on his side, and she was one orc woman against 2 armed men, and a system that did not care if she lived or died. So she stepped aside, and she watched as they took her tools. They did not take everything. They left her enough to live, the bare minimum that the law required. But they took her good saw and her chisels and her carving knives, the ones she had saved for and maintained and relied on to make the carvings that brought in what little money she had. Thorn made a note of each item in a ledger, his handwriting neat and precise, and when they were done, he looked at her with something that might have been pity if it had been genuine. "This should cover part of what you owe," he said, "but not all of it. I will expect the remainder within the month, or I will be back for more. Do you understand?" She understood. She understood that he would keep taking from her until there was nothing left, that he would bleed her dry and then move on to the next desperate person who could not fight back. She understood that the system was designed to break people like her, and that there was nothing she could do to stop it. But she did not say any of that. She just nodded, and Thorn and the bailiff left with her tools loaded onto a cart, and she stood in her empty workshop and tried to figure out what to do next. The answer came to her slowly, over the course of the next few days. She could not pay Thorn what he wanted, not without her tools, and even if she could, it would only delay the inevitable. He would keep coming back, keep taking, until she had nothing left to give. But there was one thing she could do, one way to maybe stop him from taking her land and her home. She could go to the magistrate. The magistrate in the village was a man named Aldrich Stone, a human who had a reputation for being fair but strict. Rhea had never spoken to him before, had never had reason to, but she knew that he was the one who oversaw disputes and enforced the law. If she could convince him that Thorn was cheating her, that the debt was unjust or the seizure was illegal, then maybe she could get her tools back. Maybe she could buy herself some time. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot she had. She went to the village the next day and found the magistrate's office in a building near the center of town. It was a small room with a desk and a few chairs, and Aldrich Stone was there going through papers when she walked in. He looked up when he saw her, and she saw the flicker of surprise in his eyes before he smoothed it away. "Miss Pallor," he said, "what can I do for you?" She told him everything. About the debt, about Thorn, about the seizure of her tools. She tried to keep her voice steady and her words clear, but it was hard when she could feel the weight of his judgment in every glance. He listened without interrupting, and when she was done, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "You have the agreement your brother signed?" he asked. "No, Thorn has it." "Then I will need to see it before I can make any determination. The law allows for seizure of property in cases of unpaid debt, but only if the terms of the agreement were clear and the debtor was given fair warning. If you believe Thorn violated those terms, I will investigate. How long will that take? As long as it needs to. In the meantime, I suggest you continue making payments as you are able. If Thorn has acted improperly, I will see that it is corrected, but I cannot promise anything." It was not the answer she wanted, but it was more than she had expected. She thanked him and left, and as she walked back through the village, she felt the faint stirring of something that might have been hope. It was a fragile thing, easily crushed, but it was there. She was halfway home when she saw Nolan. He was standing by the side of the road, talking to another man she did not recognize. When he saw her, he said something to the other man and then walked over, and she stopped because she did not have the energy to avoid him. "I heard what happened," he said without preamble. About Thorn, of course he had. The village was small and gossip traveled fast. She did not ask how he knew. "What about it?" "I went to see the magistrate this morning. Told him you were good for the debt, that you had been paying what you could. Told him Thorn was pushing harder than the law allowed." She stared at him. "You did what?" "I testified on your behalf. It is not much, but it might help." "Why would you do that?" He looked at her like the answer should be obvious. Because it was the right thing to do. She did not know what to say to that. She had spent so long assuming that everyone wanted something from her, that every act of kindness came with a price. And here he was doing something that cost him time and credibility and asking for nothing in return. It did not make sense. Nothing about him made sense. "You do not even know me," she said finally. "I know enough." "No, you do not. You do not know anything about me. You do not know what I am like or what I have done or why I ended up with this debt in the first place. You just decided to help me because, you felt sorry for me. You thought I needed saving. I do not think you need saving. I think you need someone to stand with you so you do not have to do this alone." The words were quiet, but they landed like a shout. She felt something crack open in her chest, something she had been keeping locked down for so long she had forgotten it was there. It was anger and fear and something else, something that felt dangerously close to relief. "I do not need your help," she said, and her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. "I know, but you have it anyway." He left before she could argue, and she stood on the side of the road and watched him go and tried to figure out what had just happened. The magistrate called for a hearing 2 weeks later. It was held in the same small office where Rhea had first spoken to him. And this time, Thorn was there with the agreement and a ledger of payments and a lawyer who looked bored. Rhea had no lawyer, just herself and the faint hope that the truth would be enough. Nolan was there too, sitting in the back of the room, and when she walked in and saw him, she felt something settle in her chest. The hearing was not long. The magistrate reviewed the agreement and the ledger, asked Thorn a series of questions about the terms and the interest, and then asked Rhea to explain her side. She did, as clearly as she could, and when she was done, the magistrate looked at Thorn with an expression that could have frozen water. "The interest rate you have been charging is above the legal limit," he said. "And you failed to provide Miss Pallor with written notice of the seizure, as required by law. The tools will be returned to her, and the debt will be recalculated at the proper rate." Thorn opened his mouth to argue, but the magistrate held up a hand. "If you wish to dispute this ruling, you may take it to the regional court, but I suspect they will not be sympathetic to a man who has been charging illegal interest to a debtor who has been making good faith payments." "Do I make myself clear?" Thorn's face went red, but he nodded. "Yes, sir." "Good. Miss Pallor, you will have your tools back within the week. The new payment schedule will be sent to you by the end of the month. This hearing is concluded." Rhea walked out of the office in a daze. It had worked. She had her tools back, or she would soon, and the debt was smaller now, manageable. She could breathe again. She could keep going. Nolan was waiting outside, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. When he saw her, he straightened, and she walked over to him and stopped a few feet away. "Thank you," she said, and the words felt inadequate. "You did it yourself," he said. "I just gave the magistrate a reason to look closer. Still, you did not have to, I know." They stood there in silence for a moment, and then she said, "The offer for dinner, does it still stand?" He looked at her, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something in his expression that looked like surprise. Then he smiled, just a small curve of his mouth, and said, "It does. Then I accept. If you still want me to, I do. Whenever you want." She thought about it, thought about all the reasons she should say no, should walk away and keep her distance and not let herself owe him anything. But the truth was she was tired of being alone, tired of pushing everyone away because she was afraid of what they might take from her. And he had asked for so little and given so much, and maybe it was time to stop assuming the worst of him. "Tomorrow," she said. "If that works for you." "It does." "Good." She left before she could change her mind, and all the way home she told herself she was not nervous, that this was just dinner, nothing more. But her hands were shaking when she unlocked her door, and she could not stop thinking about the way he had smiled. The next evening she walked to his farm just as the sun was setting. She had changed into her cleanest clothes and tied her hair back and tried to look like someone who was not completely out of her depth. It did not work, but she went anyway. Nolan was waiting on his porch when she arrived, and when he saw her, he came down the steps to meet her. "You came," he said, and he sounded genuinely pleased. "I said I would. I know, but I am glad anyway." He led her inside, and the first thing she noticed was how warm the house was, how clean and well kept. There was a fire in the hearth and a table set for two, and the smell of something cooking filled the air. It was stew, she realized, the kind that took hours to make right, and her stomach growled before she could stop it. He laughed, just a quiet huff of air, and gestured to the table. "Sit. It is almost ready." She sat, and he brought over the pot and ladled stew into 2 bowls, and then he sat across from her and they ate. It was good, better than good, and she told him so. He looked pleased, and they talked about small things, easy things. The weather, the harvest, the village. He did not ask her about the debt or the hearing, and she did not ask him why he had helped her. They just talked, and it was easier than she had expected. When they were done, he poured her a cup of cider and leaned back in his chair, and she realized that she was not ready to leave yet. She wanted to stay, to sit here in the warmth and the quiet and not have to think about everything waiting for her outside. "You were a soldier," she said, and it was not a question. He did not look surprised. "I was." "Where?" "Wherever they sent me. The border wars, mostly." "I did my time and then I left." "Why?" "Because I was tired of fighting, tired of being told who to kill and why. I wanted something different, so you came here." "I did." "And you thought leaving firewood for your orc neighbor would be a good use of your time." He smiled at that, a real smile, and she felt something warm settle in her chest. "I thought you might need it, and I thought I might like the company eventually." "Why me?" "Why not you?" She did not have an answer for that, so she just took another sip of her cider and looked at the fire. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then she said, "I do not know how to do this." "Do what, this?" "Talking to someone, being around someone. I have been alone for so long I do not know how to be anything else." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You do not have to know. You just have to show up." It was such a simple thing to say, but it felt like a revelation. She had been so afraid of owing him, of being in debt to him the way she was in debt to Thorn, that she had not considered the possibility that he might just want her there for its own sake. That he might have fallen for her somewhere along the way, quietly and without expectation, and had been waiting for her to feel safe enough to come to him on her own terms. She stayed until late, and when she finally left, he walked her to the edge of his property and watched her go. She did not look back, but she could feel his eyes on her until she disappeared into the trees. She came back the next week, and the week after that. It became a routine, a quiet rhythm that settled into her life like it had always been there. They ate together and talked about nothing and everything, and slowly, carefully, she let herself believe that maybe this was real. That maybe he was not going to ask her for anything more than what she was willing to give. Thorn returned her tools as the magistrate had ordered, and with the debt recalculated, she could finally see a path to paying it off. It would take time, but it was possible now. She went back to her carving and her garden and her life, and for the first time in a long time she felt like she could breathe. Winter came again, and with it the snow and the cold. Nolan left firewood on her doorstep like always, but now when he did she knew it was not a transaction. It was just him looking out for her, the same way she had started looking out for him. She brought him bread when she baked, and jars of preserves from her garden, and he always accepted them with the same quiet pleasure he showed when she came to dinner. One evening in the dead of winter, when the snow was piled high and the world was silent and white, She was sitting by his fire after dinner and he said, "Can I ask you something?" "You just did." He smiled at that, but then his expression turned serious. "Why did you say yes?" "To coming here, I mean. After all that time." She thought about it, about all the reasons and all the fear and all the slow, careful steps that had led her here. "Because you settled nothing for me," she said finally. "You did not try to save me or fix my problems or take over. You just stood with me so I could fix them myself. And that was what I needed, even if I did not know it at the time." He nodded like that made sense to him. "I am glad you came. So am I." They sat in silence for a while and then he said, "I fell for you, you know, a long time ago. I did not know how to tell you without making it feel like I was asking for something you did not want to give." Her heart did something complicated in her chest, something that felt like fear and hope tangled together. "When?" "The first time I saw you. You were at the market, arguing with a man who was trying to cheat you on the price of a carving. You did not back down, even when he got loud. You just stood there and told him exactly what it was worth, and he paid it in the end. I thought, that is someone I want to know." She remembered that day, remembered the anger and the satisfaction when the man had finally given her what she asked for. She had not noticed Nolan watching. "And you waited all this time." "I would have waited longer if that was what it took." She did not know what to say to that, so she leaned over and kissed him. It was clumsy and tentative, the kind of kiss that came from someone who had not done it in a long time, but he kissed her back like it was exactly what he had been hoping for. When they broke apart, he was smiling, and she felt like her chest might crack open from the weight of everything she was feeling. "You are a strange man, Nolan Quarry," she said, and then she kissed him again. They took it slow after that, feeling their way through something neither of them had expected to find. She learned that he had nightmares sometimes, dreams of the war that woke him in the middle of the night and left him shaking. She held him through them and did not ask for details, and he was grateful for that. He learned that she had a wicked sense of humor when she let herself relax, that she could make him laugh until his sides hurt with her dry observations about the villagers and their ridiculous dramas. They learned each other in pieces, small moments that added up to something bigger than either of them had thought possible. Spring came and Rhea planted her garden again, but this time Nolan was there to help. They worked side by side in the dirt, and when they were done, they looked at the neat rows and she felt something settle in her chest that felt like contentment. She had spent so long fighting to keep what was hers, to prove that she could do it alone, and now she realized that she did not have to. She could let him in, could share the work and the life she had built, and it did not make her weaker. It made her stronger. Thorn came for his payment in late spring, and when he saw Nolan standing next to Rhea on her porch, his face went tight. He took the money without comment, and when he left, Nolan squeezed her hand and she squeezed back. "He will be gone soon," Nolan said. "The debt is almost clear. I know." "And then what?" She looked at him, at the man who had waited for her to be ready, who had asked for nothing more than her company and had given her everything she needed. "Then we figure it out," she said. "Together." He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made her believe it was possible. The debt was paid off by midsummer. Rhea made the final payment to Thorn with Nolan standing beside her, and when Thorn handed over the signed release, she felt like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She was free. The land was hers, the cabin was hers, and the debt that had shadowed her for years was finally gone. They celebrated that night with a dinner at Nolan's house, and afterward they sat on his porch and watched the stars come out. It was warm and clear, the kind of night that felt like it could go on forever, and she leaned against him and let herself feel happy. "I have been thinking," Nolan said after a while. "About what?" "About this. About us." I know it has not been long, and I know you have spent so much time fighting just to keep what you have, but I want you to know that I am not going anywhere. I am here for as long as you want me." She turned to look at him, and in the starlight his face was all soft edges and earnest hope. "I want you," she said. "I have wanted you for longer than I was willing to admit. I was just afraid." "Of what?" "Of losing myself, of becoming someone who needed someone else to survive. But I do not think that is what this is. I think this is just two people choosing to be together because it makes life better. And I want that. I want you." He kissed her then, slow and sweet, and when they broke apart he said, "Move in with me, or I will move in with you. I do not care which. I just want to wake up next to you every day." She thought about it, about what it would mean to give up the cabin she had fought so hard to keep, and then she realized that she was not giving it up. She was choosing something better. "Your place," she said. "It is bigger and the barn is in better shape. We can use my cabin for storage or rent it out or whatever. But yes, I will move in with you." He looked like she had just handed him the world, and maybe she had. They sat on the porch until the stars faded and the sun started to rise, and when they finally went inside it was to his bed, and hers, and theirs. They were married in the autumn. A small ceremony in the village with the magistrate officiating and a handful of neighbors as witnesses. Rhea wore a dress she had borrowed from one of the women in the village, and Nolan wore his best shirt. And when they said their vows, she felt like her heart might burst from the weight of it all. She had never thought she would have this, had never let herself hope for it, and now here it was, solid and real and hers. The villagers who had once whispered about the strange man and the orc woman now whispered about how happy they looked, how good they were together, and Rhea found that she did not care what they said anymore. Let them talk. She had what she wanted. They spent the winter settling into their life together, learning the rhythms of living with another person. It was not always easy. Nolan left his boots in the middle of the floor, and Rhea had a habit of staying up too late working on her carvings, but they figured it out. They learned to compromise, to communicate, to laugh at the small frustrations instead of letting them fester. And every night they went to bed together, and every morning they woke up side by side, and it was enough. Spring came again, and with it, the first hints of something new. Rhea realized she was pregnant in early summer, and when she told Nolan, he picked her up and spun her around and laughed like a man who had just won the greatest prize in the world. She laughed too, even though she was terrified, because how could she not be? She was going to be a mother. They were going to be parents. The baby was born in late winter, a boy with his father's brown hair and his mother's green skin. They named him Torin, and he was perfect. Rhea held him in her arms and looked down at his tiny face and felt something shift inside her, something that made all the fear and the pain and the years of struggle worth it. This was what she had been fighting for, even when she did not know it. This was what she had been building toward. Nolan was a good father, patient and gentle and completely besotted with their son. He sang to Torin when he cried and walked him around the house when he would not sleep, and Rhea watched them together and felt her heart swell with a love so big she did not know how to contain it. They had another child 2 years later, another boy they named Callan. He had his mother's eyes and his father's smile, and Torin adored him from the moment he was born. The house was loud and chaotic and full of life, and Rhea loved every minute of it. The years passed, and they built a life together that was more than either of them had imagined. They expanded the farm, added more chickens and a few goats, planted an orchard that would not bear fruit for years, but that they tended anyway. Rhea kept carving, and her work became well known in the village and beyond. People came from miles away to buy her pieces, and she took pride in every sale. Nolan worked the land and raised their sons and loved her with a steadiness that never wavered, and she loved him back with a fierceness that surprised her sometimes. One evening in late summer, when the boys were asleep and the house was quiet, they sat on the porch and watched the sun go down. Rhea leaned against Nolan and he wrapped an arm around her, and they sat in comfortable silence for a while. "Do you remember that first winter?" she asked. "When you left the firewood on my doorstep?" "I do. I thought you were trying to trap me. I thought you wanted something from me that I could not afford to give." "I know. You made that pretty clear," she laughed softly. "I was so angry and so scared. I did not know how to trust anyone, let alone a human man I barely knew. And now I cannot imagine my life without you. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Nolan Quarry. You and our boys and this life we have built together. I just wanted you to know that." He kissed the top of her head, and she felt him smile against her hair. "I know. And you are the best thing that ever happened to me, Rhea Quarry. I fell in love with you the moment I saw you, and I have never stopped. I never will." They sat there until the stars came out, holding each other and watching the night settle in around them. Inside the house their sons slept, safe and warm, and outside the world kept turning, but in that moment everything was perfect. Everything was exactly as it should be. Rhea had spent so many years afraid, so many years fighting to keep what was hers and convinced that letting anyone in would mean losing herself. But she had been wrong. Letting Nolan in, letting herself love him and be loved by him, had not made her weaker. It had made her whole. And as she sat there on the porch with his arm around her and their life stretching out before them, she knew that she had finally found what she had been looking for all along. Not just safety, not just security, but something far more precious. She had found home. The firewood had been the beginning, a simple gift offered with no expectation of return. But it had led to this, to a shared life full of laughter and love, and the kind of happiness she had never thought possible. And all because he had asked for nothing more than her company at dinner, if ever, and had been willing to wait until she was ready to give it. She thought about that first conversation, about the way she had demanded to know what he wanted in return and the way he had answered with such quiet honesty. Company at dinner, if ever. As if that was all he needed. As if she was enough, and she had been. She was. They stayed on the porch until the air grew cold and Nolan suggested they go inside. She followed him in, and they checked on the boys one last time before going to bed themselves. As she lay next to him in the darkness, his hand in hers, she thought about all the dinners they had shared since that first one, all the conversations and the silences, and the slow, careful building of trust that had led them here. She had come to that first dinner on her own terms freely, and every day since then had been the same. A choice, made over and over, to stay and to build and to love. And he had met her at every step, steady and patient and constant, asking for nothing more than she was willing to give. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. And as she drifted off to sleep with his warmth beside her and the sound of her sons breathing softly down the hall, Rhea Quarry felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt at peace. She felt complete. She felt home. The story that had started with a stack of firewood and a wary question had become a life. And that life was full and rich and exactly what she had needed all along. Not a rescue, not a savior, but a partner. Someone who stood with her, not for her, and who had loved her patiently until she was ready to love him back. And she did love him. With everything she had, with everything she was, she loved him. In the morning, they would wake and start another day, tending the farm and raising their sons and living the quiet, ordinary life they had built together. There would be challenges, as there always were, and moments of struggle and doubt. But they would face them together, the way they had faced everything else, and they would come through. Because that was what they did. That was who they were. Two people who had chosen each other, over and over, in 1,000 small ways and a few big ones. Two people who had found something precious in the most unlikely of places, and who had held onto it with both hands. Two people who had learned that sometimes the greatest gift you could give someone was not grand gestures or sweeping promises, but simply showing up, being there, asking for nothing more than company at dinner, if ever, and meaning it. That had been enough to start with, and it was still enough now.